Thank you for coming, everyone. I'm James from Mother Tongue. I'm going to talk about transcreation, how it's different from translation or not, what the applications of transcreation are, why customers might be willing to pay a little bit more for it, why they should pay a little bit more for it. And then if I've got time at the end, seeing as we're at the Plunet Summit, I'm going to talk about the particular challenges of Plunet in a transcreation business and how they might differ from what a translation agency might have. So, Mother Tongue, where I'm from, it's a company that's been going for 25 years, based in London, now with offices also in Singapore and Los Angeles. And the important thing in this context is that our founders were previously working for advertising agencies, so in suches. And the company was set up very much with the needs of the advertising and marketing industries in mind to try and give them the sort of language services that they needed and maybe at that time couldn't get anywhere else. Behind my slides, go on. So we are unashamedly, unabashedly proud to be transcreation specialists. And I think transcreation is one of those things, so we've talked a lot over the last few days about things that happen in the industry now that we never saw 10 years ago. And I think transcreation is kind of one of those things in that 10 years ago it was very much a sort of a niche term, and I don't think most people knew what it meant. Whereas now, I think if you go onto most language service providers' web pages, you'll find tucked away somewhere a little box about a transcreation offering. So I'd like to tell you what we mean when we talk about transcreation, and obviously you can disagree or agree with me about how we interpret the term. So how it differs from translation. We all know what translation is. You have essentially a bunch of words, a document in one language, and you take those words and you put them into another language. So I think the yardstick of translation has traditionally been faithfulness to the source text. It's like, how can I say these words in this other language? And when we do transcreation, we go a slightly different route. So we ask the person who does the transcreation not to say, what does this word mean in this language, but to say, what's the idea behind these words, and how could I most naturally express that in my own language if I had that thought? And it doesn't always mean that transcreation will be completely different, because some ideas, that if you have a sentence, I don't know, like click here for more information, the German for that, for mehr Informationen, bitte klicken Sie hier, or something like that, will be very similar, because the idea is sort of perfectly expressed by the same words in both languages. But when you get into more creative items, so like headlines, taglines, funny scripts, jokes, all that sort of stuff, then you probably find that when you go that step back, you end up going down a slightly different road to get to the solution you come up with in your target language. So that's basically the mindset of a transcreator versus a translator. So here's a very simple example. I've got a couple of examples for you. I've tried to pick examples in the German and English language pairs because I hope that most people here are familiar with that. Obviously, you're all familiar with English, or you wouldn't be listening to me. And I guess because we're in Germany, most of you have at least a little German, and I'll try and help you if you don't have quite enough. So this was quite a funny job we did maybe 10 years ago, as our client was the chewing gum maker, Wrigley's, and they made these sort of comic books about this superhero called Dentiman, who's basically a stick of chewing gum, and the supervillains in this story are tooth decay and acid and sugar and all the things that make your teeth rot, and Dentiman sort of comes in heroically and fights them. So anyway, the blue things are saliva droplets, I think, and the big white smiley faces at the left-hand side of the teeth, and the chewing gum comes into the mouth, and they go, Dentiman, and he says in German, Hallo, Freunde, which on one level is the easiest thing I think you could ever hope to get as a translator. It's the easiest two words you'd ever translate. So, hallo, English, hello. Freunde is friends. So you think, well, we'll translate that as hello, friends. That, as a transcreation, would be a big X against your name in my book. You're not going to work for us like that. Because nobody in UK, when they come into a room of people that they know, would ever say, hello, friends. It's just not how we how we talk. We'd say something like maybe, hi guys, or all right lads, or hi gang, but not hello friends. So you have to go back to the idea or the scenario of what you would do if you had that thought or that idea in your own culture, and then put it into words in the way that you would do naturally. So that's a very simple example. Now I'd like to look at one that's maybe more prestigious or high-end, but also more relevant to the sort of work we do day to day. So I chose one from a very prestigious flagship German brand, the Titan of German industry, BMW. And if you're German, you probably know their claim, as you say, or their tagline, as you say in English, which is Freude am Fahren. If you don't speak German, it literally means pleasure is Freude am in driving. So, and BMW, being the thoughtful corporation they are, have actually kind of demonstrated the differences between translation and transcreation for me, because they actually have two English versions of this line that they use around the world. So they have one that they use in sort of international markets, where English is a language of advertising, but not necessarily the native language. And then they have one that they use in the UK, USA, that are your native English-speaking markets. So the translation approach is the one for international markets. Obviously, they're worried if it is something too funky or clever, it might pass people by. So they've gone for sheer driving pleasure. So it's got a tiny tinge of transcreation in that they've put in this extra emphatic word, sheer, but you can see very much that the Freude idea is there, pleasure, fahren, driving. So maybe translation, it's not a literal translation, but it's maybe what you might get if you entrust translators to do transcreation, if I can put it that way. It's got a translation mindset behind it. The English one, which again, you might know if you've been to the UK in the last 40 years, or America, because they've been using this line for 40 years. So it's a very, very successful example of transcreation, the ultimate driving machine. And the thing that strikes me about that is actually that the idea of pleasure, Freude, is not even mentioned in the English line, but it absolutely comes through. Because what's the idea behind this line? The idea is that BMW is not a way to get from A to B. Driving a BMW is an experience that makes your everyday better, that makes you feel a little bit more alive. And the ultimate driving machine, to me, that idea of ultimate is a really nice emotional way of making people feel that this experience of driving this car is something different from the norm. So I think we didn't do that one, by the way. We didn't exist in the 1970s when it's done, but I think it's a great example. So quick recap. Translation, as I said, focus on meaning, try and say the same thing. Transcreation focuses more on the message. What do we want the audience to feel? So it's not about the writer's intention as about the intended effect on the audience. Very important part of the process is who you get to do the work, because I mean, obviously, we're here to talk about technology, but I think we would all agree that good translation and good transcreation is impossible without good humans at the heart of that process. And translation is done by people who are highly skilled and qualified in translation, but for transcreation work, we look for people whose credentials is in writing in their own language. So typically, advertising copywriters, but people who've got a proven skill to craft a message and craft words in their own language, and also, because they speak good English in most cases, can take something that starts in English and put that into something that really resonates in their own language and culture. That is reflected in how we judge the work, because translation, and again, we've talked a lot about quality systems, and there's lots of ways of measuring this. Is it right? Is it wrong? Whereas transcreation is more about, does it give the right feeling? It's more about the emotions. So there's obviously a much bigger gray area of whether it's on or off brief, on or off target. It's harder to think. My 5-word summary, I think it's 5 words, of translation that doesn't sound translated. If you can tell it didn't start in your culture, it's not transcreation. So that's what it is. What do we need it for? Well, there's lots of things we don't need it for. So firstly, stuff that nobody's going to read. And there's a huge amount of that probably in the internet era, probably more than ever before. There's millions and millions of words being published in all languages, and many millions of those will literally be read by nobody. Secondly, stuff that only you will read, by which I mean if you want something for internal informational purposes, you don't want to spend money making it beautiful, you just want to get that information out of it. So very narrow target audience, you don't want to spend money on them, so translate away. And the last one, which is I think the biggest one actually, and sort of overlaps a bit with the first two, but stuff that people need to read. So, for example, we've been very hot topic, there's been GDPR. I'm sure we've all translated thousands of words of GDPR stuff, and people who, nobody's going to read that stuff for fun, right? But there will be times when people need to read that. There's information in that text that they want to extract. And so they will put up with a less than pleasurable reading experience in order to extract the information they need. So 3 areas where you're wasting your money on transcreation. What you do need it for is stuff that you want an audience to read. You're asking people when you put communication out there, whether it's on TV or online or in the printed media, you're asking people to give up their time, possibly even their money, to read your communication. And they won't do that if, first of all, it doesn't grab their attention. So if you want a clever headline that's going to suck people into your communication, there needs to be something that really jumps out and punches them in the face. If you want to make people not just appeal to them with facts and give them information, but actually win hearts and minds, again, you can't do that with turgid, unnatural, unwieldy prose. You have to write compellingly to get hearts and minds on board. And lastly, which I think is one that's possibly not so well noted, is that if you want people to hold people's interest, and this is why transcreation is not just for snappy headlines and very short scripts, but also a very good solution for long-form copy, is if you want to keep people's interest, if you want them to stay with you for page after page, then you have to make the experience of reading those pages a pleasurable one. And you won't do that if it doesn't sound natural and right in their own language. So that's what it's for. So much for the sales pitch. Now, the interesting part is money. Because it is I think everyone who offers it as a premium service, a more expensive service, and there's 2 sides to that. So the first side is it actually costs more to produce. It costs more to produce because, firstly, the talent that we use to do it charge more for their time than translators do. So copywriters are more expensive people to hire than translators. There's fewer of them, certainly highly skilled multilingual ones, and they fancy themselves, basically, and they charge accordingly. Secondly, because of the amount of sort of context and briefing you have to do around these projects, it takes more time for project managers to brief in this work. So if you're talking about that BMW tagline, there's a huge amount of strategy and research gone into thinking up where they want to position their brand, and that needs to be communicated succinctly to the talent that's doing it to make sure they have that information and can encapsulate that in their foreign language version. Thirdly, you might be able to relate to this, clients love to talk about this sort of stuff. If it's a creative job, they will want, like many clients, fancy themselves as copywriters, and they want to spend a lot of time going back and forth about a particular word, which is fine. I mean, so they should do. We like clients that care, right? I mean, if they don't care about their own messaging, who will? But you have to build that into your cost because you won't just deliver it and then invoice it the next day. You will be going back and forth. But it costs more, but the good news is, we believe, it also brings more value for the client. So hopefully, and we wouldn't have business if it wasn't the case, they will be willing to pay more for it. And it's worth more, firstly, because there's a return on this investment, a concrete return in terms of good communications are more likely to persuade people to buy your product or to buy into your message or your position that you're advocating. So there's a very financial reason that right there. Secondly, it shapes the perception of your brand. So if you're trying to be a premium, luxury, prestigious, or maybe witty, humorous, or youthful, dynamic brand, but your words that you're putting out in other languages are not witty, or youthful, or dynamic, or fun, then that's going to, over time, erode the perception that people have. Whereas if they chime with that and they match up to what you want to be, they will reinforce that. So that's an intangible but longer-term return. Third thing is that often when you're talking about advertising communications, there's a big amount of money being spent on other parts of the process. So if you think about a TV commercial or a video, you probably spend tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of pounds on producing that, especially if you've got Hollywood talent in and whatever, and then you'll spend hundreds or even millions of dollars in some cases on media to put it out into the world. So it doesn't really then make sense to try and shave $100 or a couple of $100 off the transcreation cost, so you can then very expensively put out a very ineffective message. So that's why we've been able to persuade people to pay for our services. What's Plunet got to do with it? Apologies to Tina Turner there. So obviously, Plunet is very much a product it's all about translation management, as the slogan says somewhere. But why did we, as a Transcreation agency, come to Plunet? Well, first thing to say is I'm going to talk about the challenges and benefits of Plunet specifically in a Transcreation context, because obviously you're all very familiar with challenges and also benefits of Plunet for translation agencies, and you wouldn't be here if you hadn't decided that the benefits outweigh the challenges by some margin. Reasons that you have to be careful, I think, as a Transcreation agency when doing this sort of change. First thing is that the nature of creative work is that every project is different. So while there is scope for automation and templatization, it's not as great as it is with your standard translation project. So you shouldn't do this thinking that it's going to obviate the need for your project managers to still write these careful briefs and spend a lot of time creating bespoke projects. It's not going to work like that. And equally, the pricing is much less standardized than I think. We seldom price Transcreation work per word, even when it's long copy. There's always an element of judgment about the level of creative difficulty and stuff that's in there. And so that is something where you can't get as much benefit from Plunet as you would if you're just pricing everything on a standard rate per word. Second point is the type of talent we work with. Again, I mentioned earlier that copywriters tend to be quite full of themselves as a breed. Apologies to any copywriters in the room. And it was definitely quite challenging to persuade some parts of our supplier base to come on board with this project. There's very few people that haven't come on board. And we have made a couple of exceptions for people that we really like and don't want to lose, and we work very hard to find who are having a little tantrum about it. But it's more problematic. Whereas a lot of the translators that we use for the more translation type work we do said, "Oh, great, I know Plunet already. Yes, good. That'll make it easier for me." The third thing is a more harder point to articulate, maybe. But as an agency, we've always hired project managers, not just on project management skills, but also on linguistic skills and on a love of language. And we've always really drilled that into our people. Like I said, if we don't care about it, who will? And I personally, I was sort of concerned about the message we're sending out to those people if we say we're now prioritizing efficiency and automation over craft and that more artisanal feel. But if you do automation and integration of processes well, then what we hope we'll find and what we're starting to see is that you actually give people more time to do the parts of their job that they love and that they can bring their specialist skills and passion to, and less time shuffling files and doing mundane things like check budgets and all that sort of stuff. So it actually empowers them to be more creative and spend more time on the parts where they can add value. Secondly, obviously, we're different in some ways to other LSPs, but we're not that different. We still have to do things like when we send a job out, there's still a budget, there's still a deadline, there's still a description. When we get an invoice, we still need to process that. We still need to check that it's paid and actually pay it and make sure suppliers know all that stuff. So there's a hell of a lot of overlap what we do with other LSPs and indeed any other business that has suppliers. And Plunet can really help with all that stuff. And thirdly, again, I return to the point of culture. I think that definitely within Mother Tongue, there has at times been an element of people almost getting too caught up in the uniqueness of every job and spending too much time agonizing over the right quotes and the right form of words. And actually, a little bit of automation, templarization will help them, again, to simplify things that can be simplified and focus on unpicking the complexity of things that genuinely are complex. So that is what we hope to get out of our Plunet journey, which is still quite a new one for us. So thank you very much for listening, and if you've got any questions, let's talk.